This is Will to Win Overcoming Long COVID. I'm your host, Jillian Angeline, and my goal is to raise awareness about the hundreds of millions of people worldwide who are dealing with the after effects of the COVID virus months and in many cases years after contracting it. I know a little something about that myself. I got COVID in February of 2020. 6 surgeries later, I'm on a road to recovery and healing, but it hasn't been easy. Now, these episodes are for informational and educational purposes and do not constitute medical advice. Please contact your medical professionals before trying anything we discuss during the show. Now let's get started. Today's guest is Dr. Philip McMillan. He's a physician and researcher out of the United Kingdom. First of all, talk with me about how you got into this world of the COVID pandemic and the after effects and the research that you've done over the last 5.5 years.
Well, the first thing to start with is that I'm a physician. I work with patients in a hospital environment. I've been doing this for over 30 years, and I've always had an interest in complex diseases. So even prior to COVID, I had been spending about 12 years working out the primary pathophysiology of dementia. And this was a personal passion and journey that I had. And literally, in the months before COVID hit, I had put together what I thought was the framework that would be able to help that whole condition. So it was very important research. And so then when COVID hit, I thought to myself, because I developed a unique way of doing this kind of clinical research, I said, well, if I can do this with dementia, a pretty good chance I can do it with COVID. And so it simply was that at the beginning of the pandemic, I started in about February of 2020, I started to do the research. And my aim was to try and understand the disease. And the better you understand the disease, the better you will be able to find solutions for it. And that was literally my starting point. And out of that research, once I started to look at the patterns, when I saw in the first data coming out of China, 76% of the people had hypertension. There weren't really any children. And I knew straight away from a clinical point of view that made no sense. And so I started to try and see if I could understand what was different about COVID from, say, any other viral infection. And that's what led me into the principle of spike protein autoimmune responses. We first did this in April of 2020. I have spent the past 5 years trying to educate the medical and the scientific community that if you don't understand this point, almost nothing makes sense in the context of the pandemic. And that's essentially where I started and still where I am today.
You've talked about working with doctors from across the entire world, being able to come to these conclusions and do all of this research. What is that like for you to be able to collaborate with doctors from South Africa and from multiple continents around the world? Because certainly COVID does not know any borders.
It was a huge privilege and a tremendous opportunity. When I think back, and I started doing interviews about COVID from about March of 2020, and I would speak to anyone who was in the scientific community who had ideas and theories and bounce them off them. I spoke to people from China. I got one of the professors there. I spoke to people in the US, and eventually I spoke to people in Europe, in Belgium. There's Gert van den Bosch. I was the first to interview him. I actually spoke with Dr. Robert Malone. I was the first to do a video interview with him as well in 2021. This is before there were all these issues that happened afterwards. So one of the very important things that I got out of that is that I was able to speak to people before you do the interview and after. And what happens then is that you get people relaxed and sharing stuff that they may not have said in an interview environment. And so I then had this huge trove of information and experience from experienced clinicians, immunologists, virologists all across the world to then add to that dimension and that research that I was still doing independently.
thank you so much for that. What is your latest work going on right now? We're in the summer time frame. Some things are slow in a lot of the world, the professional world. Yet, you are still putting out a lot of research, a lot of information. You recently had a live video about the impacts of the vaccine on women's menstrual periods.
So there are a couple of angles here that I have to clarify in order for people to understand how my research is working. What I think we are, and I'm privileged that a small team of, there are just about three of us who are working consistently, and we've been working for years together. One of them is a professor in the US who I'd been working with since May of 2020. Another one is a professor in the UK. He's retired, but he was the guy who discovered ACE2 in 2020. So these are pretty high level people, and we gradually work through the research to try and understand it. And there are three prongs to the research at the moment, and we're working on them independently, but we're trying to pull them together because our aim is to try and tie the whole picture together, not just long COVID, but exactly what happened in severe COVID. Why did some people get it? Why were these specific demographic patterns? Who was affected and why? And then we're doing research on what I call the COVID storm. That's a spike triggered autoimmune response mechanism. And what that means is what happens in reinfection for people who have already been vaccinated. Is it the same disease? Is it different? And so these three prongs have produced almost three separate conditions that need to be understood. Very similar to what you would get with chickenpox versus shingles. The very same virus, but a completely different manifestation based on the timelines. You get chickenpox first, but if you get reinfected, it can then present as shingles or reactivated. And so it's that kind of research that we're trying to do to pull all the pieces together to make sense of the pandemic.
I appreciate that. Let me double back once. And you mentioned ACE2. You talk a lot about ACE2. Anyone who researches your name, you see the phrase ACE2 receptor mentioned quite a bit, or serum ACE2. Um, Tell me a little bit about what that is. There's an excellent explainer on the McMillanResearch.com website. It's about 3 minutes only. So for anyone that wants to see an explainer as a visual person, they can go look at that. I certainly learned a lot from that myself, looking at that earlier today. But maybe in a short form, tell me what that means. I know it's tied a little bit with blood pressure, maybe fluid balances in the body.
So the first thing you have to understand is every virus uses a key to open the lock to get into a cell. And for each virus, they have different targets that they go for. And so, in the context of SARS-CoV-2, that lock that it was looking for was ACE2. The key was the spike protein. So the two have to come together. And then when they come together, it can unlock the door that allows the virus to get inside the cell. As simple as that. And for different viruses, so there are some other coronaviruses where instead of ACE2, their lock is DPP4. So, or if it's flu, it's neuraminidase, and so every virus has its own lock that it targets. And then it has a spike protein that would then be the key to open the door. So, in the context of COVID 19 and SARS-CoV-2, that lock is ACE2. That's what the virus uses to open the door, to infect the cell, and then to go on to replicate. The problem is that when people think of ACE2, they only think of it in the airways because that's how it infects. It infects the upper airways, infects the cells, goes down into the lungs, and it can infect cells in the lungs. But there is also ACE2 inside the bloodstream. And it's very important because it's part of what we call the renin-angiotensin system to control blood pressure. And if you have ever heard of ACE inhibitors like ramipril, lisinopril, all of these prils are ACE inhibitors. And so you have the body producing first ACE, and then you have ACE2. The two enzymes work together. So the point is that it's one thing that the virus will infect the upper airways and just replicate, but once it gets inside the bloodstream, that's a different ballgame. And that's where a lot of people get confused. They don't realize that severe COVID 19 is about the interaction between the immune system, the virus, and ACE2 in the bloodstream.
I personally was dealing with a lot of microclotting. In my experience with COVID, I worked with Dr. Vaughn out of Alabama. He looked at my blood and he sent me the images, the green images of the clots. I was on triple blood thinner therapy for for a couple of months until I realized that it was uh, making me bleed more than I should have been bleeding. And so a lot of people talk about clotting tied with COVID. It's not just a respiratory issue. So when you talk about ACE and the bloodstream with COVID, are you referring to clotting?
Well, one of the things to understand is that, and this is why I said there are three separate things. One is severe COVID, another is long COVID or the post acute sequelae of COVID. And then there's a third bit, which I call the COVID storm with reinfection. Okay. So the first thing is to understand the severe COVID. Why did especially young people who didn't have any lung disease die with severe COVID? Now, it wasn't purely about the virus because the virus can do damage to the lungs, but you can survive with even 20% of your lungs and you would be able to breathe with oxygen. But what was different in severe COVID was critically what we call microclotting. And that was an inflammatory response happening inside the bloodstream, damaging the lining of the blood cells, the cells lining the bloodstream. And then what naturally happens is once there's any damage, it makes a clot. And so this was happening all through the lungs. And this microclotting was the cause of very severe COVID, where even on a ventilator with 100% oxygen, a person would still die because so little of their lungs was left. Now, it's very important to differentiate that from the microclotting that is occurring around long COVID. And that is a separate condition for which the mechanism for the microclotting is linked, but it's not quite the same. So, in effect, a big part of what happened with the clotting is what we call a thing we describe as macrophage, or the better way to describe it, people will understand if I first say neutrophil extracellular traps. What happens is that in severe COVID, say, when there was a lot of inflammation in the lungs, the neutrophils, which are the pawns, the basic white blood cells, they don't live very long. They're the ones that make pus and so on. So they just attack anything and do what they do. One of the things that they do is that they make these nets. They kill themselves by making themselves into a net and trapping stuff because that's how they get rid of some bacteria or some viruses. But when they do that in the bloodstream, you get clots. Okay? In the context of long COVID, a similar kind of pattern is happening, but at a lower level. And very often it seems as though it involves a different kind of immune cell called a macrophage. And one of the things that we are doing with our research is that we have tied every aspect of the disease, either severe COVID, long COVID, and the COVID storm, to a hyperactivated immune response with this macrophage. It's a unique immune cell. It does a lot of things. It's normally very helpful, but if it gets overactivated, it can do a lot of damage to the whole body. And that's the challenge that we have ahead of us. How do we get this back into the box?
That's really the big question. It is so refreshing to hear someone like yourself that's on the front lines, that's doing this work that started in February of 2020 when I first got COVID, to know that you were already trying to figure out how to fix this. I've said this in other shows and episodes, and I'll say it again. My mom always said for the last 5.5 years, I wasn't in a why me, woe is me. It was a let's fix this. And, to be able to talk to someone like you who wants to be able to find a way, like you talk about the future, trying to fix this, the goal is to almost reverse that, or at least get the body back into balance, correct? So, are you working with others on therapeutic measures to try and get the body back into balance for people who are dealing with post COVID?
Yeah. Now, that's a very important question. And I want you to first understand something that I usually say to patients. They don't necessarily like to hear it, but I always say the truth. The first thing you have to realize is that post COVID and long COVID doesn't happen in isolation. Meaning, if you infected the whole world again, the same people who had long COVID will get it again. Because, in effect, long COVID is not actually a disease, it's a hyperactivation of underlying inflammation. So let me rephrase that because this is very important to understand. I describe long COVID as spraying petrol on the embers of a fire. The embers were there, the infection sprays petrol on it, and it bursts into flame. Now, the flame you focus on, not realizing that the embers were the predisposition. If you do not address the embers, the risk will remain in the future. This is why I am saying to patients now, I'm saying, please stop looking for quick solutions when it comes to long COVID because you had a predisposition because of pre existing macrophage activation. When you then have COVID and you have hyperactivation, that's the fire. So everyone is focusing on dousing the fire, not realizing that we also need to address the embers. And so there's a difference between managing symptoms with long COVID and actually addressing the embers of inflammation to get you back to wellness. There's a very big difference. One is short term, the other one is long term.
So, how do we find the embers?
Yeah, this is where the trick is that it's purely about understanding that person. So if I was talking to a patient, I usually take them back, sometimes 15 years. I want to understand the trajectory of what was going on. When we did our first paper on long COVID, we focused on the fact that we knew that the majority of inflammation was in the gut. We confirmed that by biopsy. And in effect, this is the driver for most people, not everybody. There are about three primary locations there's the gut, there's the sinuses and epipharynx, and there's, say, the lungs. If you have any one of those being inflamed, you can then get long COVID symptoms. Now, even if you suppress the symptoms, if you then get exposed again, it can flare up again. And so the challenge, as I said, this is not a sprint, this is a marathon. And if you're trying to sprint when you're doing a marathon, you're not going to get better. And so the challenge is to help people to understand where are the embers. And that's from the history. So this is the part that is not easy in the sense that I can't create a protocol that will work for everybody because I need to understand, well, really, where are your embers? For some people, it's pretty clear. It's their gut. They have all kinds of gut symptoms. They have loose stools, they have constipation, they have bloating. If you have got that, that's definitely one of the embers. If you don't fix that, even if I take away your symptoms, your predisposition is still there and the virus is still circulating.
I think about how I have, the antibodies for EBV, Epstein-Barr, from years and years ago. I think about that. And a lot of people early on talked about, there were EBV long haulers, that were tied with COVID long hauler because they had the antibodies for EBV as well. But then I think about the gut issues too, and then you think about all those things, and it really gets you to start wondering. You know, there's more to do to fix your health, and there's always something we can do to improve our health. I watch the videos about like eating less processed food and trying to have a well balanced meal and eating the rainbow and all those things to try and get your gut in check.
Yeah, fundamentally, and I can sense, even just listening to you, I can tell for you personally, one of your challenges will be the gut. Now, it's not easy. That's the first thing. As I said, I have seen it, and that's why I've changed my angles. In that, a lot of people would come, you can have a consultation with somebody, you can give them some guidance, but you need to work with them on the journey because it is so complex. It is not simple and straightforward. And so, therefore, that takes time. And one of the biggest challenges that we have to resolve is that for most people, they want a quick solution. And I understand that. But the reality is that it takes some time. It has taken many years in order to get those embers in place. It does take some time to put out to douse the fire and to keep it in check so that that risk is not there in the long term.
I've certainly been an impatient person, but I will say that, you got to take it one day at a time for anyone that may be struggling or listening to this because, you know, everything, nothing about this is an overnight solution. I've been through 6 surgeries. All of those surgeries were, let's see if this works. Oh, there's still more issues. Let's fix this. Let's go back and, address these other issues that are in the veins. So I'm certainly aware that it's not an overnight solution. I do want to digress for a moment and focus on that recent live video that you posted about the menstrual period concerns for a lot of women. That's that. I didn't get the vaccine, but a lot of women. I've had issues with my period as someone as a long hauler, and I know other women have. Other women have talked to me about it. People have posted on social media about it. Are you seeing? One of the most interesting things you said, I think, during that live video was that there were components of the spike protein impacting progesterone. And I thought that was fascinating because that's something, the way that you said it, I hadn't heard that theory or the way that it was described so clearly. Can you explain that again for any listeners on this show?
It was an interesting find because I had looked at this many years ago. So I'm not an obstetrician or gynecologist, I'm a physician. So, just in case any are listening and saying, why are you talking about this? Well, I did do some research on it. And the principles are very simple. The menstrual period is exceptionally sensitive. As you know, any stress, any exercise, just so many things can throw it off. And so the fact that it changed after COVID vaccination, I thought was a red flag. It needed to be explained. You can't see that and just ignore it. Now, it does happen with a few other vaccines, but not at the levels that we saw with COVID vaccines. So the big question is why? Why in the world would the vaccine trigger abnormal patterns with bleeding? So when I had raised this question in social media, of course, I have lots of people who don't like me asking these questions, so they get very upset. And one of the people pointed out a paper about what happened with in vitro fertilization. And they had looked at a cohort of maybe about 40 people who were having IVF, who were vaccinated and compared to unvaccinated, and they found no difference, except that they found that higher antibody levels were associated with progesterone being elevated. I knew immediately this was important. Now, we don't know the mechanism, but suddenly that makes sense. If you have a change, because the way how that menstrual cycle works, it's estrogen surging first, then it comes down, and then progesterone at the end of the cycle. If you had a change in progesterone at a different point in the cycle, it would be no surprise that the bleeding pattern could change with it as well. Now, many of these changes were transient. And so this has been taken as a reason to say it's no big deal. I disagree. I say that any change that you cannot explain are likely to be connected not just with the hormone progesterone, but potentially receptors, potentially the ovaries. You need to know if you are doing this in young women of childbearing age who are exceptionally low risk for severe COVID. I'm not sure if I am willing to let the scientific community get off without that question being asked. I think it's extremely important, and I would challenge anyone who downplays it, saying there is no evidence of when no research has been done. And so the big study coming out of Australia looking at social media and GP records, highlighting that this was very clearly an abnormal pattern. Sadly, this is 5 years down the line or 4 years down the line. We should have addressed this many years ago.
I can also say that May of 2020, one of the worst nights of my life having COVID, or the COVID long haul situation. I almost died on my mom, multiple times that night. And the next day I got my period. So everything was surging at that moment. There must have been something going on. There was some mechanical issue or something with progesterone, something along those lines that was impacting and causing symptoms to flare up exponentially. So I can certainly say from personal experience that it wasn't just the vaccine that was causing those concerns and changes with that time of the month.
Yes, absolutely. Infection can do it as well. And so part of the reason why there's not been as much of a concern is because, well, it can happen as well with infection. But it's usually with people who are having significant infection. And I suspect a serum viremia virus is circulating in the bloodstream. When you do it in the context of the whole population, where people may not have had that experience, it's still a risk and one that we still have to address.
Is there hope that, we can help people get back to where they were before the pandemic? Maybe even before that, because you talk about those embers that may have been, bubbling up for years before the pandemic happened. Is there hope in your mind to help so many people get better?
Absolutely. And I think this is what I'm focused on. I think the biggest challenge is to help people to understand that this is a journey rather than a moment. This is not a tablet that will get you better. But there is a journey. And I believe that if people take that journey, address the embers, they will not be just before they were before the pandemic, but they are likely to be better because they would have hopefully addressed some, if not all, of the risks that were in place before. It's important to note that another part of what we're talking about with the hope is that when you think of long COVID, you're thinking about the pandemic. But in reality, there have been a whole cohort of people who have been suffering from MECFS, fibromyalgia, post Lyme, Epstein-Barr, who have been struggling for decades with no solutions. And what we are doing now, and this is my challenge personally, and this is why the research has taken 3 years, is that we are trying to not just answer long COVID, because how can you answer long COVID and not be able to answer the spectrum of diseases that are connected with it? And so we have to find a way to resolve these issues, not just for people who are affected in the pandemic, but for the big cohort who have been struggling for the past 20 or 30 years in terms of these post viral conditions that there has not been a lot of research on. There is a way forward. And I believe that once you understand the disease, you can then give the body the chance to heal.
And the impatient part of myself is saying, can we figure this out tomorrow? But I understand where you're coming from and what you just said, that it does take some time. So for anyone who may be listening, hang in there. It's going to get better. And there's a message that you may start to feel better than you ever have if certain things can align in the right direction.
Absolutely. There is always hope. And the beauty about this is that in reality, even though there are many symptoms and people have been struggling and they don't feel well, there is an interesting light that is there. And the principle is simple. Generally, people who have long COVID or similar conditions tend to be more hypervigilant. They tend to notice things more. They tend to be more sensitive when they are unwell. In that is, even though they are having more symptoms and they're feeling unwell, in reality, those symptoms are protecting them from ignoring conditions that can also cause long-term damage. And so the truth is that if we can settle the symptoms, if we can get those individuals feeling better, very often, because of that natural hypervigilance, they will be in a much better position for their future health.
What beautiful way to put it. Thank you so much, Dr. McMillan, for your help. I really appreciate it. And I look forward to keeping in touch with you as I continue the show.
Wonderful. Thank you very much, Jillian. Appreciate the opportunity.
If you have any topics or suggestions, I'd love to hear them. Contact me on Instagram, Angeline_travels, or on X @JLAngeline. I'll see you later.